You are the architect of your law firm, episode 005. Are you ready to make your law firm a profit-generating machine that will free up your time and skyrocket your impact? With more than 2 decades of business growth experience and having proven that you can be successful while prioritizing your family and your impact, introducing the Profit with Law podcast. I am your host, the creator of the Firm Differentiator 10X Effect, Moshe Amsel. Well, hello and welcome back to Profit with Law, and this is your host, Moshe Amsel. Today we are going to be talking about planning. Planning is all about being intentional about the growth and trajectory of your law firm. And what planning is one of those things that is often talked about and thought about, but seldom implemented. I am sure that a lot of you listening to this have thought about sitting down and really mapping out your next year and really planning for what's going to happen. And some of you, it never crossed your mind. And some of you might actually be doing planning and implementing it and seeing the success. And some of you might be doing planning, but you're just not doing it correctly. So what I want to cover on today's episode is just to really drive home the point of what the purpose of planning is and why it's so important. We're going to cover on future episodes some of the things that you can do to go through your planning and to really make it successful for your firm. But I want to go back and first I want to just tell you a story in my own journey. And this is back when I was working in the IT industry. I was working for a technology company that was servicing schools. And we had a really good year where we went across the country and visited a number of schools and sold about a couple of $1 million of sales in the busy selling season, which was just a few months. Then we sat down and we said, okay, we did a couple of million. What if we were a lot more intentional about how we were doing this? What if we sat down and we really mapped out a plan of knocking out a lot more schools in this 3-month time frame that we had? And it spent about half a day to create the plan and write it out and hash it out and move things around and figure out what we needed to put into place to make that happen. And our projections were that we wanted to get somewhere between $30 and $40 million of sales in the next year during that period, which is 15 plus times what we did the year before. Obviously, that's a very aggressive number, but to get to 2 million, we just kind of rolled with the punches. We just went with things, went with the flow and just followed the way that the road was turning and we didn't really plan for it. And this time we actually created a plan of attack. And by creating the plan, it made us realize that we needed certain things. So for example, the salesman, who happened to be me at the time, the salesman who was going out to meet with these schools to try to get the sale, needed to be efficient with where he was going because we're going nationally. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't going to the same city multiple times, and that if we were doing travel from city to city during the week, that we were limiting how much time we needed to travel from place to place. So you're not going to send me to California one day and then to Florida the next day. Rather, you send me to Florida, Tennessee, Alabama, and just go in that area, New Orleans, keep me in one concentrated area for the week so that I'm not bouncing from place to place and spending a lot of time on the plane. And by sitting down and creating this plan, it became apparent that we needed somebody full-time to take care of making the arrangements, the travel arrangements, and scheduling the appointments with these schools. And then we needed a support staff behind the salesman. So basically, I went out and I met with the school and I found out what their needs were. And I surveyed the physical property to get estimate, so basically we were doing installation of computer and telephone systems in the schools. And we needed to document what wiring was needed and what kind of system they needed based on their needs. So there was a whole bunch of questions that I would ask when I was sitting there meeting with them. But I would then have to take that back and create a proposal. Now, if I'm going out and doing the traveling and I also needed to create the proposals, then that would significantly slow down my ability to be able to hit as many of these targets as possible. So what we did is we had somebody behind the scenes who I would then basically fill out information in a spreadsheet that was predefined, pre-created, and the person behind me would go and take that information and turn it into a nice estimate that can then be delivered to the client. And at the end of that season, we successfully closed $30 million of new business. And the reason that we were able to go from $2 million to $30 million with that endeavor was only exclusively because we created this plan, because we hashed out the details of what would be required to make that happen, because we put ourselves in the position of what does it look like to get from where we are today to where we want to be next year. What are the steps that we need to take? We already had the learning experience the first year. Now we knew what we needed to do to get to that next step. And by putting that plan in writing, we then were able to implement and execute on the plan. So that's just an example from my own personal experiences of how powerful a plan could be. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, I want to take my law firm from $250,000 to $1 million, or I want to take it from $50,000 to $250,000, or I want to go from $1 million to $10 million, whatever the number is, wherever direction you want to go, if you take the time to plan and write the plan down and go through all of the iterations and possibilities of what could happen and what you need to do in order to make it happen, and figure out what are the needs of personnel, what is the financial needs that you're going to have, where are you going to have shortfalls during this process that you're going to have come up with extra cash, so you can be prepared for those inevitable possibilities as you grow. You will be much more likely to be successful. And the reason is because you will have anticipated a lot of the things that normally would stop you in your tracks. Normally, when you hit a bump in the road, you're either derailed, slowed down for a long period of time, or you stop completely on the endeavor that you're doing. You say, this is not working, and you go and try something else. And this, having this anticipation of what's going to happen in advance really prepares you for this and says, okay, I have a plan. Another example for me personally is investing. And I don't know if you're invested in the market at all, but if you are, then everyone knows that you're supposed to buy low and sell high. But many people don't make money in the market. Many people lose their shirts in the market because they trade on fear. Because when everybody starts exiting the market and the market starts to drop, they exit the market too. Or worse, they watch as everybody's exiting the market and they try to hold their own, and they say, I'm going to hold out. I'm not going to sell. I'm going to ride this out. And then it drops and it drops and it drops. And if they're in a real crash and they're losing 30, 40% and you have a lot of money in there, at some point you don't have the thick skin. You're going to jump out and you're going to sell. And now you're selling at the bottom. And now you're losing your ability to be in on the recovery. Where am I going with this? Well, if you have an investing plan and you anticipate that there will be ups, there will be downs, then instead of getting nervous and running for the hills when the market is going down, you will have already put cash on the sidelines ready for that opportunity. And when the market crashes, you're going to find entry points that you're going to be putting cash into the market, and you will be far ahead of everyone else. And my own personal experience was in the crash in 2008. When that happened, when the market hit bottom, I started aggressively maxing out my tax deferred accounts. Any cash that I had, I put into the market. And people took 4 or 5 years to get back to ground zero, whereas I recovered much more quickly and was in a much better position at that point because of not because I have thicker skin than anybody else. It's because I had an investing plan. I knew exactly what my goals were, and I knew exactly what was going to happen, and I was ready. I know that at some point it's going to hit a bottom and it's going to come back up. So I'm not going to time the bottom perfectly, but at some point I'm going to re-enter the game. At some point I'm going to start deploying cash into this market, and it might fall further, but it'll also come back. And that is the key of having a plan. So some examples that you might understand of planning and why it's important. Let's say you're going on a road trip and you need to go from New York to Miami. Well, you know that you need to go from New York to Miami. But if you don't know how to get from New York to Miami, then you can get in the car and start driving. And you could be driving for a very long time. You know the trip from New York to Miami could take 24 hours, so you'll drive for 24 hours. But it's possible that you'll end up in the middle of the country or near the West Coast because you've been driving in the wrong direction. So a GPS or a map is a tool that can be used to create an instantaneous plan for you. And the GPS can even alter your plan for you based on traffic conditions, road closures, and things like that. But it's a plan. For those of you who remember, before GPSs were around, or were mainstream at least, we had maps. And my family used to travel from New York to Toronto to visit my grandmother. And we would always, we always had a map, so we knew exactly where we were going. But even more than that, we would go in the winter and we'd be traveling through the snow belt in the Buffalo area. So my father would call the trooper barracks along the route on 17 to check with them on the weather in those areas before we even got in the car. Because back then, we didn't have anticipation of what kind of weather we would expect. And if we left blindly, we could end up in a massive snowfall that the car just couldn't handle, and we would get stuck on the side of the highway with no cell phone. We had a CB radio was our only form of communication, and it was very scary. So we had to check beforehand to see what obstacles are going to be on our way, and if it was bad in that snow belt, then we ended up taking the thruway all the way north and then all the way across west on Interstate 90, for those of you who are familiar with the area. But that was a much longer trip. It was a better trip from a weather perspective than it was worth taking that extra detour and getting there safely. Another example is teachers. Teachers have lesson plans. Now, why do teachers have lesson plans? Don't they know the material? Don't they know what they want to teach? Why do they need a lesson plan? Now, this is another take on it, so they're not trying to avoid pitfalls necessarily, but if they don't follow a lesson plan, they will very quickly fall behind in the material they're trying to cover, because it's so easy to get distracted in the classroom and to have people ask questions and not realize that you're way off topic and that the time is slipping away from you. So the purpose of the lesson plan is to make sure that you cover the curriculum and the time allotted to you. So when you have a finite period of time and you need to get a certain goal accomplished in that finite period of time, having a plan to follow is extremely important and crucial. And then finally, the best example, which is what I used for the title of this podcast episode, is an architect. Now, it would be ludicrous to think that you would go out to build a building or a house without having a blueprint first. Why? Because if you went without a blueprint, then first of all, the house would never get built, because you can't get all the workers to be on the same page of what exactly it is they're building without them being able to refer back to a plan and say, okay, I need this beam here, this wall here, this room is going to be here, this bathroom is going to be here. So it's obvious to us, even though we're not architects, it's obvious to us that you need a plan of exactly how the measurements need to be in order for the house to become what was envisioned by whoever it was that wanted it built. Even if it was without a vision, we would be hard-pressed to imagine that the hallways would be straight, or that the walls would be straight, or that the roof would be in the right place if we didn't have an architectural plan created for that building. So I've used multiple examples to highlight the different things that a plan does for us and what the benefits are. So these are some of the benefits of having a plan. Number one, a plan prevents errors. And by preventing errors, you're saving time, which is something we're going to get to shortly. But preventing errors does so many things. It increases efficiencies. It makes sure that the end result is what you wanted or anticipated. So by creating a plan, you are creating a direction to follow that will allow you to skip the mistakes that you would potentially have made along the way had you not thought about it and anticipated those and worked around them instead. A second thing that a plan does is it removes inefficiencies. It removes inefficiencies because you're not making wrong turns along the way. You're not taking detours. You're not hitting roadblocks. You are on a mission, and you're going to get there no matter what. And because you have clearly articulated where you're going and what it's going to take to get there, you know exactly what to measure, and you know exactly how to tell whether you're on track for that or not. Another thing that a plan does is it allows for commoditization of efforts. And what that means is that it allows you to input resources where you would otherwise wouldn't be able to. Let's go back to the architect example, right? You can have people with different skill sets that can take that plan you created and work off of it to do their trade. So you can insert a framing person into the project, and all they need to do is look at the blueprint and they know exactly where the frame needs to go. You can insert a plumber into the project, and the plumber will know exactly where the pipes need to go. You can insert an electrician into the project, and the electrician will know exactly where the wires need to go. Similarly, in your law firm, if you have a plan, you can insert a paralegal into the firm, and the paralegal will know exactly what their job is. You can insert an associate into the firm, and the associate will know exactly what their job is. You can insert a receptionist into the firm, and the receptionist will know exactly what their job is, because they all have the plan that you've created. They all know exactly where the firm is going and what their job is, what their piece of the puzzle is to complete in order to get the firm to the destination. And finally, the final benefit, and this is really the key, is that it reduces time to the destination. I don't know how to say this, but every single one of you will most likely be successful to some extent over the course of your career. There's no question in my mind that if you start your own law firm, you will figure it out. Sure, there are people who give up, but if you're not going to give up, you will figure it out. But let me ask you, would you rather have $1 million firm in a year, or would you rather take 10 years to get to that point, or 25 years? There are attorneys that I run into who are very successful, but it took them 15 years to create that success. And then there are attorneys that we see that get highlighted in these award ceremonies that have had 1,000% growth in a year, and they've gone from a $50,000 firm to $1 million firm in a year. What's the difference? What is the difference between them? Now, it's quite possible that someone who got to $1 million didn't have a plan and they basically got lucky, which is a possibility. But more likely than not, the ones who experienced rocket fuel growth are the ones who literally had a written plan of how they were going to get there. And they followed their plan and they stuck to it. Even when things didn't look like they were going to work, they stuck to it and they made it happen. Having a plan will reduce your time to destination, guaranteed. Now, I mentioned this earlier. I used the GPS example. The GPS example highlights the fact that even if you have a plan, that plan can change along the way. And this is important to understand because planning is not a rigid process. It's not something that you create the plan at the beginning and then it stays that way till the end. As a matter of fact, if you're going along with the architect and blueprint example, I heard somebody tell me once that they knew somebody who was in the building industry. They had a certain supply company and they did most of their work with RFPs, and they owned a yacht. And the name of the yacht was Change Order, because they make all of their money on change order requests after the RFP is completed. What happens is that things come up and people realize that, oh, the original plan did not include X, Y, and Z that I want in the final product. So now I need to change the plan in order to make sure that I get there. So there's many different reasons why we would have to change a plan along the way. But it's important to understand that the plan is the starting point. It's the thing that is going to get us started and keep us focused and keep us moving forward. But it doesn't mean that you can't go back and change the plan. So if you have resistance about creating a plan because what if it doesn't work, or what if I decide that I want to do something different, sure, you can do that. But you will still get to that juncture faster if you have a plan and you're following the plan. So what does it take to have a plan? What's the anatomy of a plan? How do you get started? So this is going to be how I'm going to wrap up the episode. I'm going to go through the anatomy of the plan. I'm not going to give you the logistical details of how to create it. We'll discuss that on another episode. But the broad strokes are, you first and foremost, over anything else, need to have a goal, a destination that you're heading towards. If you don't have a goal or a destination that you're heading towards, then you can't figure out how to create the plan. In the examples that we had, the GPS, you had to know where you're going in order to put the destination to the GPS. The GPS is useless if you don't know where you're going. The architect cannot draw the plans of a building if somebody doesn't tell him, this is what I'm looking for. I'm looking for a home with X number of bedrooms and this type of layout and this, how many bathrooms on this floor and that floor. You need certain details in order to create that blueprint, right? You need to have an end in mind in order to create the plan. And this is a saying that I've heard, and I don't know who to attribute it to because I've heard it many times, but begin with the end in mind. If you begin with the end in mind, then you can create a successful plan and you can succeed in getting to the end. The next thing to think about is the shortest distance between two places is a straight line. And one of the keys to creating a plan is to create the situation where you have the shortest amount of time to get to your destination. So the next thing that you need to look at is, I'm here and I need to go there. I'm at point A, I need to go to point B. What is the shortest distance? What is the easiest way for me to get from A to B? And if you can answer that question, then that becomes the foundation of your plan. That becomes the skeleton of your plan. Figuring out what the shortest distance is, what is the least number of tasks. In episode number 4, I talked about the one thing. This piggybacks on that. If you can start to identify what are those one things that you need to focus on in order to piece them together to create that end result, that's going to be your shortest distance from the beginning to your goal. The next key to the plan is that it needs to be on paper. You can't just imagine it in your mind and expect it to work. If the plan is not written, if it's not published, if it's not hanging in your office, it's not going to happen. And I can tell you, even if you don't create the plan, if you just created the goal, if you don't hang that goal up, let's say that you have a goal of bringing on 15 new clients in Q1. If you don't hang that goal up on the wall, I can guarantee you that 6 weeks into the first quarter of the year, you will not even remember what the goal that you set 6 weeks before was, let alone be able to figure out whether you're on track to hit it. If that goal is not written and is not something you're looking at every single day, there's no way that you're going to be able to get to it. So it's very important that the plan is on paper, written out. And when you do that, when you write it out, what that's going to do is it's going to make you aware of which parts of the plan don't work. One of the easiest ways that I fine-tune the financial part of the plan is by putting the numbers on paper. Because all of a sudden I realize, in order to produce 12 of these cases, I'm going to have to hire another associate. If I hire another associate, we're not going to be profitable. So either we're not pricing the product right, or we're inefficient in producing and delivering it, or we need to scratch this completely and go with a different product. So that becomes obvious when you start putting this all down on paper. Until you put it on paper, it just sounded good, right? You thought, okay, 12 cases and they're $4,000 a piece. That's $48,000 in 3 months. That's a good number. Everything is great. But you didn't think about what it costs to deliver on it and figure out all of the variable expenses that are going to be affected by the additional work. So putting it on paper is going to really help you flesh out the plan. Now, once you put it on paper, there's 2 portions to the plan. There's the actual steps you're going to take and what's required to implement the plan. But then there's another dynamic that's not easily discernible by just looking at it, and that is the time estimation. You have to then insert time into your plan and figure out how long is each piece of this plan going to take. Because without that, you can have a plan, but the plan could go on forever. You can always be on the plan, and you're just not taking the next step because you're dilly-dallying on the last one. So time is very important because that creates the deadlines, creates the urgency, and is what keeps you moving to the next step. And then you need to document the plan. So before I said you need to put the plan on paper, that's in the planning stage. Now, once you know what the plan is, you've created a time estimate for everything. Now you need to clearly document that plan. And when you do that, you also need to figure out what are the key metrics that we need to keep our finger on the pulse of. What are the key metrics that we need to measure that will allow us to get the feedback required to know whether we're on target for this plan? So identifying what those key metrics are, some people call them KPIs, key performance indicators, but identifying what those key metrics are is extremely important, and that's part of the documentation phase. And then finally, you get to the implementation phase, which is where you implement the plan. And ultimately, when we go through the planning process, you'll see that implementation is not the last step, because after implementation, you go back and measure and you tweak the plan. So I subscribe to a philosophy called lean planning, and I'll go into that in much more detail on another episode. But lean planning, basically, the idea of it is that we don't create this monster plan for the next 5 years, but we basically just create a plan going out for 12 months. And then every month we look at the plan again and see where we're at, and we add another month on the end of it. So the plan is constantly moving. It's a moving target, and therefore we're also tweaking the goals during that process as well. So we might start with a goal. So let's say I start with a goal of $1 million in a year, and in order to hit $1 million in a year, I have to hit 50,000 in month one. Now, if in month one we hit 100,000, now we're ahead of the game. Now we can move all of our targets, and we can expect to maybe hit 1.5 million in 12 months because a month went by. So now it'll be over 13 months. We're planning to get to 1.5 million from the inception of the plan, but we're a month in, so we added another month on. So I don't want to confuse you too much. I hope that made sense, but basically the key is that once you documented the plan, you then need to implement it, because it's all great on paper, but without taking action, you're not going to get anywhere. So, in summary of what I covered here on this episode, planning is crucial if you want to achieve a goal in a specific time frame. If you don't care how long it takes you, or if you don't care about whether or not you're successful, then you don't have to bother with planning. But if you're listening to this podcast, if you're listening to this episode, I am sure that you are just looking for information on how to make your firm succeed faster. And if that's what you want, then you need to schedule a day sometime in the very near future to sit down with no interruptions and write down what is my goal for a year from now, and how am I going to get from where we are today to that goal. What do I need to put in place on the marketing side? What do I need to put in place operationally? What do I need to have in place financially? What are the pieces of the puzzle that I need to fill in to get from point A to point B? And I guarantee you that if you sit down, you spend a day, you will emerge from that day. Even if you don't know how to create a plan, you will figure it out. You will emerge from that day with a written plan that you can execute on and you can put into place, and you will start to see massive results in your firm. And I look forward to hearing feedback about this in our Facebook group or our LinkedIn group. Join us there for the conversation, and let's talk about your details. So thank you so much for listening today. I will see you on the next episode, and I appreciate you guys tuning in, and I hope that this was helpful. Take care. Have you been enjoying the show? We sure hope so. To make sure you never miss an episode, be sure to hit the subscribe button in your podcast player app. Next week, we will be back with more valuable resources and ideas on how to break the mold and take your law firm to the next level.